Hey, so Yakri here with another artifact video. This time I want to talk about some basic card game concepts, or I guess do like a showcase, an example of how these basic concepts interact with a particular card, Kanna, in Artifact, and with some of the mechanics unique to Artifact, right? Because I want to in particular talk about value and resources, and you've probably heard of these terms before. In the event you haven't, resources in a card game, or I guess you could say in board games in general, right? They're anything you can use up, right, that you have access to and you can use them up. So gold is a resource in Artifact. Your mana is a resource in Artifact. Your life points, the life on your towers, is a resource in Artifact. And we'll go back to that in a second. But your cards that you have available, that's a resource in Artifact. And your creeps that spawn each round would be a resource in Artifact, right? There's something you get that you don't always have control over it, but you can take control over that resource and use it, right? So these are all resources that you get automatically as part of the core game, right? Gold you have to kill things to get, but that's kind of an inevitable thing that happens typically, and it's a core part of the game, right? When things die, you get gold. Okay, so I don't think I'm missing anything. Going back to your tower's life as a resource, I believe there's some famous old MTG article about this, but basically the idea is that you can, a little less in Artifact, right, than, well, no, just as much in Artifact, but in very different ways. MTG in particular, this was a big thing, right? You can block creatures, and if you block with a weaker creature, your creature is going to die. And so sometimes you might want to not block with that weaker creature because it might have more value being alive than it does protecting your life points from damage. And in that sense, you can say, all right, my life points are a resource. I can spend this resource by not protecting myself to allow my opponent to just, waste their time attacking me, to allow me to do other stuff, right? So it's a resource you can spend. In some cases, literally, when we had Phyrexia and they've got the mana that you can spend life to use instead of actually using it normally. And so it's an actual resource in that context. But what I really mean is that you can take advantage of the fact that you don't die instantly. You don't have to block every hit and use it as a resource. And you can do the same thing in Artifact, right? When we talk about sacrificing a lane all the time in Artifact. And so you can give up a lane, right? You're sacrificing HP on the bet that the advantage that you'll gain from letting your opponent kill your tower and maybe your ancient eventually will be enough that you can kill them first, right, before they hit you. And so you're spending life points in order to gain some kind of advantage, possibly stranding an opponent's hero there or something, or not having to spend some other resources instead to keep the resource of life, right? Okay, so I got into a and let's see. Wait, I didn't cover value, did I? Right. So value. I'm just covering these in the sense that I've experienced these words in the past, right? So perhaps if you come from a different gaming subculture, it might not have quite exactly the same meaning. But where I come from, value means what you get out of playing a card or using a resource or something in terms of improving your board state with the goal of winning, right? So, like if you're playing a creep that costs 2 mana and it goes onto the board, you've improved your board by the amount of putting that creep onto it, whatever effect that has, and it's giving you however much value that creep is worth. So if you have 2 creeps and one's worth one gives you like 2 damage and 2 life, and one gives you 4 damage and 2 life. You'd say, well, this 4 damage and 2 life, it's better value. It improves my board state more than the creep that's just absolutely weaker in every way, right? You see what I'm saying here? And of course, that's a very simple example. You could do a more complex example where, the creeps have different unique abilities, and you say like, well, I feel this one unique ability gives me more value, I gain more advantage towards winning the game by playing this for this amount of resources than I do by playing the other card for the same amount of resources. Okay, so that's what I mean by value. And another thing you can think of is denying your opponent value. So if they have put a lot of resources into a lane, right? They have invested a lot into that lane or into a strategy or whatever it is, right? It could be a single card that they've invested a lot of other resources into. Maybe they've played a ton of cards buffing up one single card that can be eliminated. Well, that represents a high risk for them, right? Because if they buff up, let's say I buff up a non-hero unit for some reason. I do a bunch of modifications on like a big creep and it's very powerful, and it cost me like 3 cards to get it to this point, but it's going to one-shot your tower. That's if I can one-shot your tower and like win the game, that's just pretty decent value for me. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I guess it depends on how much bonus damage I got out of all these resources I spent. And if you can kill that creep with a single card, right, you're going to get better value out of that trade, because I spent like 2, 3, 4 cards, all my mana. Maybe you cast Slay. That's 3 mana. It's probably not all your mana if I'm playing 4 cards on something, and you've gotten rid of the creature, and it only took you 1 card to do it. That's a pretty good trade for you, right? That's a good deal. You got a lot of value out of it. So that's the basic concept, right? So if you invest your resources into anything or any location where your opponent can get rid of them all at once, that's a risk. It's possibly a risk worth taking, right? But it represents an opportunity for you and for your opponent. If your opponent can't take advantage of it, it's good for you, and you gain more progress towards winning the game. And if your opponent does take advantage of it, then perhaps you lose progress towards winning the game, right? Perhaps it actually sets you back and puts you in a disadvantageous position, right? So spending those like 4 cards I used to buff up that creep that got killed by Slay, that was bad for me, and it put me in a worse position than I was before I played those cards, because I've expended those resources now and I don't have them anymore. Okay, so that's the basic concept. I got into this little argument with someone on Discord where they were telling me like, Kanna makes lane really strong, blah 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 blah. They said a bunch of things I don't really disagree with, actually, but they said, she gives you these 2 free creeps every round, and I had a huge disagreement with this, because they're not free creeps. You have 2 creeps every round that spawn, and they can go into any lane. Kanna makes them come into her lane. They're not free. You already had those creeps. You're not getting 2 more creeps. You have 2 creeps, and you're just picking where they go. And the thing is that it's not even 100% under your control, because the degree to which you can choose where these creeps go is limited. They go where Kanna is, and you have to move her through a limited number of effects, right? It's not super easy to move heroes in this game by design. You have to move her to a new lane if you want creeps to spawn in a different lane. And if you manipulate that in a really effective way, and perhaps you do use those limited resources to, build up a little bit of a lane, and then you fake out your opponent to investing some resources and stopping you, and maybe you do get the best out of this trade. But the thing is that this is a risk for you, right? Because you are taking these resources, these creeps, and you're investing them into one spot. And it's particularly, this is a kind of somewhat of a unique artifact thing, right? If you have all your resources invested in one lane, it can be easier for your opponent to take them out in a number of ways, right? So for example, if you have all of your creeps on one lane and you're committed to going 80 on that lane and winning there, and your opponent on a different lane takes initiative with a take initiative card, passes over to that lane and annihilates it without you being able to do anything about it, you have been set very far back, right? It's given them a great deal more value than you got by putting whatever resources you did into that lane, right? Presumably, right? This is assuming a situation where you put, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards into it, or even just time, right? Because every turn, Kanna is investing your resources into a lane. And, if you want to really make the most of that, you need to put even more resources into that lane, because your opponent's probably not going to just leave you alone to take that lane. Or if they feel comfortable doing that, it's because they believe that as long as you don't invest more resources in that lane, they'll be able to win faster on the other 2 lanes, which is probably true. If you just leave Kanna alone in the lane, and the person who has Kanna in that lane does not play any other cards, he's probably not going to win the lane fast enough to go up against other, very competitive decks, right? Maybe you could pull it off in draft, not in constructed though. Not in a case where your opponent really has options to deal with this potentially. So it represents a risk for you, and perhaps it's a risk worth taking. I'm not coming in here and saying, "Oh, Kanna's a terrible card. You shouldn't be running her. She's weak, and your opponent's just going to take advantage of it and beat you." Right? And we're just talking about her passive, right? Forget her freaking summoning dogs. Forget her good base stats, right? We're just talking about her passive, really, and like how you should think about it in order to better understand the game and to give yourself an advantage when you're playing games of Artifact. And I think that this is the way to think about it, that it's taking these resources that you're always going to be getting, and you're just controlling where they go. And the thing is, since you're controlling where they go in a way that is not fully under your control, you just know that they're going to go somewhere for sure instead of randomly places, and they're going to be concentrated. That can be taken advantage of by you. And if you have a deck built around doing that, probably you can take better advantage of it than your opponent can. Probably. That's what you're betting on, right? However, it also, your opponent knows that these resources are going there, and they have an opportunity to cast Annihilation. Now, admittedly, one of the reasons Kanna is very good right now is because there's a limited number of ways to take advantage of this. You mostly just have to play a blue deck and use at any cost, or Ignite, or Conflagration, or Annihilation, and you can really, whittle away at this Kanna lane, or potentially just obliterate it in one go. And there's not too much access, or any access, I forget, to doing this outside of blue, and there probably should be. There should probably be, some other color that has some other access to board wipes. Otherwise, you might have this very rock paper scissors gameplay isn't totally bad, I would say, but different discussion. But if you have extreme rock paper scissors, where rock always beats scissors, that's not super healthy for a game necessarily, and this could be exacerbating that kind of thing a bit, right? The fact that you need blue to beat wide board states effectively. Red and black and green have some alternative options for dealing with this, but maybe one of those colors should also have some board clear, so that maybe we don't always have to. Anyway, it's getting too off topic. So let's wrap this up. What is really the final conclusion? The whole point of this thing that I'm like, what's the word for what I'm doing here? Rambling on about here. What I'm rambling on about here is that Kanna dogs, they're not, or the Kanna dogs, the Kanna melee creeps coming into your lane instead of other lanes, it's not free. It's a resource that you have available to you. And as someone else in the Discord put it very adeptly, simply, that those creeps in another lane represent at least 4 HP of tower damage your tower is protected from, at least, right? Now, your opponent can spend resources like cards to get rid of those creeps, but essentially he's spending resources to get about that much value away from you, right? So if your opponent spends a slay on a melee creep, that's a fairly large expenditure of their resources to get rid of this 4 HP creep, and potentially you can take advantage of that. Like, oh, they can't play slay now. All right, here goes my other blocker that's a better option for me. That type of thing. So, and potentially one of those creeps is coming down and blocking like a fucking 30 damage bristleback, who is now gonna not be able to kill your ancient in 2 turns, and you win the game because of that, right? Not definitely, but over the course of the game, you're gonna average out some decent amount of value from those creeps being sent to other lanes as well. So you have to, the point I'm making here is that when you're playing Kanna, right, you have to actually, you can't just kind of brainlessly put her down, maybe versus really bad players, but you can't just brainlessly put her down and be like, that lane's great, it's gonna be strong, it'll get value, because a smart player is gonna like drop an annihilation on you, or like wait until you've invested a little bit too many creeps in that lane, and then kill Kanna, and while she's gone, they'll take advantage of your creeps being there to either like do something like pump up Stonehall Elites, or just leave the lane dead while your other lanes are weak because they didn't have any creeps in them, right? And the same goes for kind of like any sort of board presence where you're investing resources in a particular board and artifact. You got to be aware of the fact that your opponent could potentially have a way to clear out your resource investment, whether that's putting stuff on a hero that does not have rapid deployment, then your hero gets killed, whatever like items or modifications they have are no longer available to you. And the Oath is a good example of that one. Black hero gets killed out of the lane, now you're not getting the Oath benefits, and maybe that was a huge misplay from you, right? Because those resources are now gone from your hand. You don't have the card, you don't have the mana, you don't have access to using the mana in that lane, and you perhaps could have used it for something else before you died that might have been more valuable. And now your opponent has kind of gotten ahead of you. You know what I mean? So yeah, be mindful of these sorts of things. By all means, play Kanna, but be aware of the fact that your opponent can play around and somewhat take advantage of the fact that having Kanna likely means you're committing hard to one lane. And this gives them an opportunity to take advantage of the fact that you are less committed inherently to other lanes. Oh yeah, there's one other thing I was going to mention, which is that in Artifact, having Kanna in your deck makes having low stat heroes more of a liability than it is without her in your deck. Why? Well, because you have a much higher chance of being directly facing an enemy hero who can kill the shit out of you if you don't have creeps to potentially be blocking that hero instead in your other lanes. Of course, Salamene Storm takes advantage of this by putting Kanna in a lane, and you put Drow Ranger in the lane, and she ends up way off over to the side, and she's not blocked by a hero, and can't die without your opponent using cards. And probably a more limited list of cards than they would otherwise have to use. So, yeah, anyway, I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to get out there. And I don't want to even call this resources and value and artifact. This is more like a general, like a subnote commentary than a real general article or guide on this topic. If you would like more detailed information on anything I've discussed here, please let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching. Yakri out.